Hello, my name is Natalia Calderon, and today I'll be giving my speech on the history of women in U.S. politics. In 2020, there was a record number of women running for public office. According to the Center for American Women in Politics, when compared to the 2018 election, there was an increase of 22.5% of women who ran for the U.S. House and a 13.2% increase of women running for the U.S. Senate. This paper will talk about the history of women in U.S. politics. As a political science major, I have learned firsthand of the achievements of women in U.S. politics. The sources used in my speech came from the websites of the organization mentioned in the speech, as well as government websites. As mentioned, this speech will talk about the history of women in U.S. politics, and there are three main points made in this speech. First, women did not get the right to vote until 1920, but despite that, women found ways to influence politics. Second, the rise of feminism during the 1960s gave rise to an increase of women running for public office. And third, during the 1990s to 2020, women continued to run for office and get elected to public office at an unprecedented number compared to previous years. Let's begin learning about the history of women in U.S. politics. Despite not having the ability to vote before 1920, women still found ways to be involved in politics and make their voices heard. In 1848, the first women's rights movement in the United States took place in Seneca Falls, New York. It famously was known as the Seneca Falls Convention. The convention marked the beginning of the women's rights movement. Not only did women want to be seen as equal to their male counterparts, they also wanted the right to vote, which will allow women to take a more formal and active role in politics. During the convention, the most controversial objective was to give women the right to vote. This, however, became the biggest objective in the women's rights movement during this time. According to the Library of Congress, the National Women's Party was founded in 1916 to fight for women's right to vote. The National Women's Party began to protest the White House in 1917. The group employed tactics such as distributing pamphlets, lobbying legislators, and organizing parades. This led to protesters being arrested, imprisoned, and force-fed when they went on hunger strikes while in prison. Their tactics paid off. This led to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1990 by Congress, which was then signed into law in 1920. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, there was a significant increased number of women joining politics during the 1960s. Women's participation in politics had a massive growth during the 1960s to the 1980s. The rise of feminism during the 60s led to an increase in number of women seeking public office. The National Women's Political Caucus was founded in 1971, whose goal was to increase the participation of women at every level in the political system. The caucus came as a result of the failure to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in 1970 in Congress. The founders believed that equality for women will only come when women are represented at all levels of public office. Two groups were then created to get women into public office, Emily's List and the Susan B. Anthony List. According to its website, Emily's List was founded in 1985 to fund political campaigns for Democratic pro-choice women. The Susan B. Anthony List was founded in 1993 to help Republicans pro-life candidates to be elected to public office. During the 60s and 80s, there were many firsts for women. These are some of the women who made history during this time. Geraldine Ferraro became the first woman to be nominated for vice president on a major ticket in 1984. Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman to serve as U.S. Supreme Court Justice in 1981. And Lottie Shackelford became the first black woman elected mayor of one of the largest 100 cities in the United States after she was elected mayor of Little Rock, Arkansas in 1987. The 1960s to the 1980s saw an increase of women running for public office. However, this trend continued to increase into the 1980s to 2020. During the 1990s to 2020, women continued to run for office and get elected to public office at an unprecedented number. According to the U.S. House Archives, the election of 1992 became to be known as the Year of the Women, because during this election, voters elected more women to Congress compared to the previous years. Over the recent years, there has been a representation of women in positions that had only been held by men before. Condoleezza Rice became the first black woman to serve as U.S. National Security Advisor in 2001, and the first black woman to serve as U.S. Secretary of State from 2005 to 2009. Kamala Harris became the first woman to ever be elected vice president in 2020. Let's conclude what was talked about today. This speech gave the history of women in U.S. politics. Women have had a long road in attaining political power alongside men. Despite not having the ability to vote before 1920, women still found ways to be involved in politics and make their voices heard by creating organizations and protesting. Second, as the result of the rise in feminism, women's participation in politics had a massive growth during the 1960s to the 80s. Lastly, during the 1990s to 2020, women continued to run for office and get elected to public office at an unprecedented number compared to previous years. In recent elections, there has been a trend of women of color and of other underrepresented groups that have been elected or appointed to public office. These trends influence the next generation of women to continue to pursue jobs in politics and to continue making a difference for people and women everywhere. Thank you.